MMOs as a genre have struggled to have good stories because, first of all, an MMO cannot have player agency. It cannot. So, take a game like Skyrim, for example. The world can be shaped by your decisions. If you kill an NPC, they can be dead. And they can stay dead if they want to. If you, in a single-player RPG, if you blow up a city, when you go back to that city, it can be blown up. It can stay blown up. But if you don't blow up that city, it can stay not blown up. But in an MMO, we need all players to arrive at the exact same point in time with the exact same preposition. So, if we are going to fight a dragon, we have to tell a story where it builds up to where there would be a dragon that we're going to fight. And it doesn't matter if when you hear there's a dragon at the top of that mountain, you would say, yeah, then I'm not going up there. It doesn't matter if you say, tell me no more, I want to fight the dragon right now. It doesn't matter. You literally have to get to the dragon with the exact same quests as everybody else. And so that limits how active a story can be, as opposed to if you're playing something like D&D, and my brother says there's a dragon, because my brother's always the DM, and there's a dragon up there. What do you do? Oh, we turn and run. All right. The dragon pursues. What do you do? We hide in a nearby cave. Okay. And we can do that, and that story can play out, and that can be different than what he intended. That can be different than anything he could have imagined, and it was made because it was entirely in our imagination. An MMO cannot do that. Single-player games can do a little bit of it. They can do anything that they've scripted, but they could script multiple events. And so you can have varying amounts of flexibility that an MMO cannot have. And so when writing a story, it's very hard for MMOs to be as detailed. Second of all, MMOs have to appeal to massively large groups of people, and traditionally are seen as a type of content that is a games as a service. So it has to be something they can continually update. Story is immensely expensive to develop and write and produce and voice act, and yet a lot of people only want to play through a story one time. And so story is incredibly expensive for an MMO for what you get. Because in a game like Final Fantasy, where there is 10, 20, 30,000 hours worth of content that a character can pursue, that gives you the ability to get 2 or 3 or 4,000 hours without ever doing anything you don't want to do. But even for a game that is story-based like Final Fantasy, only really like 400 of those hours are going to be story. And out of 5,000, 10,000 hours, that is a very small percentage. It's a very small percentage. And yet, it is some of the most expensive content they make. And so a lot of MMOs have found that it's easier to develop a game that will appeal to that style of player by just making story a secondary note. It's just easier. And so, for the genre, they are not known for having good story. There are a handful. I've heard good things about the Star Wars games. Final Fantasy is known for it. But when players talk about MMOs as a whole, and you talk about WoW and EVE Online and Guild Wars, which has a lot of story, but it's optional, and you talk about New World coming online, and you talk about Ashes of Creation coming online, PlayStation or Phantasy Star Online 2 New Genesis, all the different various MMOs over the years that have come and gone. Story as a general trend is a smaller portion. So when you find a player that likes MMOs and picks up Final Fantasy as their next MMO, it is not uncommon for that to be a player that has been conditioned to either like these games because they don't have story, or like these games and get their story satisfaction elsewhere. Because the previous MMOs didn't do a good job at it, so they just learned that I'll just play a different style of game when I want to do story. My brothers read books for story, and if they play an MMO, they play it for things like PvP, things like hardcore progression, things that are unique to MMOs. PvP doesn't take place in single-player games. My brother that's a DM loves narrative, and he plays a ton of single-player games. When he plays an MMO, he pushes escape on the story. Because he's just conditioned to believe it won't be as good as a single-player experience. So let's get to the thing that makes the MMO unique. It does all the things that a Skyrim playthrough can't. Which is things like PvP, things like hardcore progression. Which is why right now they're actively playing Diablo 2. Because Diablo 2 does those things well. It allows for that kind of hardcore acquiring of items. Challenging yourself. Seeing who can get the better gear. You know? And then for PvP, we play a lot of shooters. We play Rocket League. They play a lot of MOBAs. I really don't like MOBAs, but my brothers do. They've played a lot of MOBAs over the years. So they can get that kind of competitive nature. So it doesn't take one type of game to satisfy a person. You can dip into different games for different aspects of what you like about games.